All right, hello everybody. This is Kubernetes SIG architecture meeting for February 20th, 2025. We have a pretty full agenda, so let me display that and we'll get going. Okay, Dan, you're up first.
Okay, so I had added this a month ago, I guess, and wanted to point people to the CAP so people could review it. But then there haven't been any architecture meetings, and it did get reviewed anyway. It's merged. It's happening. Endpoints are being deprecated. There are still some open questions that have essentially been deferred to the future. That being, is it possible for us to actually stop generating endpoints at all for services by default rather than as something that users can just configure in their clusters? And can we stop running the endpoint slice mirroring controller? And none of these questions are urgent at this point, I guess. But at some point they'll come back for SIG Arch to think about. Oh, and also, is there more of an API contract for the existence of Kubernetes endpoints than there is for endpoints in general?
So is there, do you have a proposal for how we should go about deprecation? At one point, we allowed deprecation of things. I'm not sure we still allow that, like GA things to ever go away in our policies. But we control our policies. Yeah, did you have some sort of proposal around that, or what were you thinking?
Well, okay, so as David just said, deprecation doesn't mean gone. The API, is being deprecated. If you, in fact, it's already updated in 1.33. If you use it, you'll get a warning saying this API is deprecated, use endpoint slices. So the real question is, what does it mean to deprecate the endpoints and endpoint slice mirroring controllers? And definitely we want to remove them from conformance, and we can do that. The question is, can we make them off by default? And Tim raised his hand.
I mean, that was more or less what I was going to say. Like, there was a lot of discussion in the KEP. The early stages seem uncontroversial, and I think we will learn as we move through those early stages about the viability of doing more.
So we have the metrics right now already to tell us whether people are using those APIs. So if in 2 years, right, we're like, the top, cloud providers and Red Hat and whoever else, it's like, you know what, 99.999% of our clusters show no usage of this. Maybe we feel comfortable removing it or turning it off by default for a release or two. But I guess we can deal with that when it comes. I'm correct there, right? We have the metrics, like we flag warning, deprecated API usage gets flagged as a metric somewhere.
It does. It will be muddied a little bit by the fact that we have generic controllers that list watch all APIs that exist. And so like garbage collection controller and namespace cleanup controller will, every time you clean up a namespace, it's definitely going to list and delete all of the endpoints in the namespace. So it will show up as use, which will get bucketed in as, yep, deprecated endpoints got hit. So it's not as clean a signal as like when you had a beta version of a thing in favor of a GA version of the thing, and we were totally fine with the GA version, and the generic controllers prefer the most stable version, so they'd all moved up to the V1 version, and the only things left hitting the deprecated beta versions were like bad, neglected stuff. It is not as clean as that.
Should we invest in something like self-identified user agent, like I am the garbage collection controller, you can ignore me for this purpose or for certain purposes?
The last time we had, well, I guess that would not necessarily mean that we put that in metrics. So we could have 2 buckets. So okay, I will withdraw the last time we had user agent, it caused us issues. Okay.
Making it possible to opt into turning off this API and having all the entry stuff still function properly, like making the entry stuff tolerate absence of this API if the person running the cluster opts into turning it off. That seems like a great starting point. So people who know their use and know they don't need this and want the performance benefits of turning it off can do so without, causing any issues for all the core components. Yeah, beyond that, it's really hard to say without more data about use. We could probably get that data. It's just not as easy as inspecting the identity-free metric of who hit the endpoint, which is unfortunate.
There is discussion in the CAP about, well, are there missing metrics that would, blah, blah, blah from the PRR section, right? So yeah, there's discussion about should we add metrics, logging, events, something to help administrators decide whether they can turn this off. And the plan is to do something. I forget if we actually came up with anything concrete before the CAP merged.
Okay, Dims?
Yeah, so I agree with Jordan about having the toggles to switch them off. And I would go a step further to say that we should have a set of CI jobs that will run with the toggle off. So we get some faith in, like, nothing else being broken, especially in the immediate neighborhood of Kubernetes, like controller runtime and things just around our ecosystem. Try to get a little bit more of those folks to try it out as well. So at this point, when do we know that we'll have like a two-way door for switching it off that somebody could try? Is it soon, or is it?
It's the Cube controller manager has an argument that you can just tell it turn off these controllers, right? So you've always been able to turn it off. It's just about making that legal.
Okay.
And
so we could set up the CI jobs right now then.
I mean, we know currently the E2E tests will fail.
Right.
And that's one of the things that I have to do is fix all of that. So yeah, but having CI jobs is part of the CAP as well.
Okay, then let's deal with the conformance, especially, right? Let's unmark the ones that that are going to fail, and or update them to use endpoint slices or whatever, right? If they aren't already. So let's do that first. I mean, I'm trying to see what we can do in 133, right? So yeah, just dealing with some CI jobs right now would be like the immediate thing that we could be doing that will be fruitful.
I mean, for now, I would think something needs to be. We never did. I think the only other deprecated GA API we had was component status, and we never put it into conformance. So do we have a mechanism for removing something from conformance? I guess the conformance tests are new every single release. So you're conformant to a particular version. So we can simply say, in order to be conformant to this next version, you need to support endpoint slices. You don't have to support endpoints, and we can still consider you conforming. I don't know if we want to do that, though, if we think there's a lot of tools out there that will break if endpoints don't exist.
I mean, there's tools that write endpoints, and there's tools that read endpoints. It's actually pretty cheap to keep supporting tools that write endpoints if, a tiny fraction of the endpoints that exist on a cluster are these custom written endpoints. Like if they want to keep writing those, that's fine. We can keep the endpoint slice mirroring controller running to copy over these handful of custom endpoints. Like that's fine. And if they don't have writers like that, then there's no cost. And if they do, the cost is in proportion to whatever they're writing, which presumably is acceptable to them. So continuing to support endpoint writers means keeping the API available and keeping the mirroring controller running. And both of those are like free if they're not writing, and in proportion to their use if they are. So that seems very reasonable to me. Endpoint readers are a lot harder to determine use of, and that's what we would be breaking if we stopped syncing all of the pod IPs into these.
But at this point,
okay,
at this point, endpoints don't support dual stack. They don't support topology. There's one or two other things that they don't support. So any like real, software has to have been ported to endpoint slices at this point, pretty much. It's only going to be bits of people's automation and, scripts and stuff like that that are still looking at endpoints.
Yeah, that's like the long tail though, right? Those are the people
that
want for stuff because it's not.
Yeah.
So I'm sure this is relitigating something that was already decided, and just slap me down if it is. But like why can't we have an API that uses endpoint slices as the source of data and just presents the data as endpoints?
So, the goal here is to stop doing the work, right?
Not do more work.
Well, no, I mean, to not have your control plane writing out all of these endpoint objects to etcd every time something changes.
Right. So if your reader instead is backed by endpoint slices and just presents the data as, we do conversions from storage versions every day, right? Like
they're not bijective. You can't, like, endpoint slices made changes because of scale problems in endpoints. So you cannot go from one endpoint slice to one endpoint object.
I mean, if you're saying could you have like a virtual endpoints API where they're not actually backed by etcd?
Yes.
And
they're not materialized, right? It's an unmaterialized.
I mean, yeah, in theory, we could move the endpoints controller from KCM to API server, right? And just generate the answers on the fly.
So we've never done anything like that, but like as software people, like that's kind of what an API is for, right? But our API has been called paper thin or anemic by various folks because there is no abstraction in our APIs. It's basically just an object store, and I don't think it's a bad thing. We've done some weird things usually in service on read and those sorts of mutations, but they're not the easiest things to maintain. Like, could we do it? Yeah, probably. I'm not sure it's a can of worms that we really want to open.
It's fair.
So what comms are going out for 133, Dan? Like, can we start tom-tomming people that it's going away?
It's not going away. We're not telling people it's going away.
Switch over.
We're telling people who are using it to use endpoint slice.
Yes. Okay. Sorry.
So the all the officially for 1.33, what's happening is it is marked deprecated in the API, which of course means it will never ever go away. And but we are mentioning at the same time, look, we want to make it possible to disable the controller, so you should make sure all of your code is using endpoint slices, and then eventually we'll have some sort of events logging metrics to help people notice when they do have things using endpoints.
Okay. Have we bottomed out on this one? Any other points? I don't think we answered the question, but
well, that was the later
extra work. Don't do extra work.
A lot of the stuff people have said, goes along with what was already discussed in the KEP discussion. So it seems like there's broad consensus around what we already merged. So that's good.
Yeah, I think focusing on how we would tell providers to answer the question, is this being used? So if there's metrics we're missing or things that would help answer that question, so that as we get this rolled out,
If we can bucket our own components into a separate metric.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So that's probably the next point, Dan, is just to start exploring how we can make it safe for operators to eventually turn it off and know that they're not breaking anybody. Okay. Awesome. Next item. I'm not displaying it anymore, but David, you're up.
Yeah, so this comes out of a topic from uh, late last year where we were talking about what if we eliminated the beta stage? And the answer there was no. We talked about it, what is the point of betas, and we concluded that betas were valuable because it provided a way to have a feature on in production that could be disabled if it misbehaved when it went into production. So it was sort of like GA, but if we have to turn it off, we can, versus GA, which is you just can't ever turn this off. It's there now, unconditionally. And so I took that and I tried to write a document that I think summarizes where the conversation landed. I've got it linked here. There are several sets of comments in it. I think most largely supportive of the idea. Um, the idea being that beta, since it is on by default in production Kubernetes clusters, should be essentially complete. It should have all known issues resolved. It should have its full monitoring capability that comes through in PRR. And that when it is ready to be GA, we can know that by having it be a zero diff change. The difficulty, which I did address in the document, is what do you do if you discover you have more work to do? Right. So, for instance, you realize, hey, I need a new field to be able to bring this home, or I need some new sub feature to have it on. And this, I talk about the need to have a separate gate for the additional functionality. And the reason for that is that once you've been on in production, the first part of your feature will be load bearing. There will be, cluster admins that rely on it. There'll be users that are using it. And if you end up in a spot where the additional functionality is broken, so imagine you add a field and somehow that field's controller goes nuts, doesn't work properly, you leave cluster admins in a really tough spot. If they disable a feature, then their users won't work anymore. And if they leave it on, then whatever bad behavior is happening will continue to be on. And that's why there's a need for a second gate, to add additional functionality to the beta API, right? Or to the beta feature, I guess, not API, this is specifically beta features, right? In my opinion, that could still, at the discretion of the SIG, start as beta. I think that's a discussion point we need to resolve. I don't see a reason to make every new part of every feature start in alpha, right? Similar to refactorings, where you look and say, hey, this is a risky refactor. I want to refactor it and have a gate to turn it off. I could see this falling into a similar category. But I think that's one of the few final pieces to resolve in the doc. And if we all more or less agree, I would open a PR into the enhancements repo to go through sort of a final sweep, address all comments, and hold our new features to the standard.
Sounds really good to me. So one question was, sorry, I didn't raise my hand, was around, sorry, Tim, I didn't see you. Yeah, so is there any specific method that you're going to use for, is it like a separate feature gate, or are we going to add a syntax to it, to the existing feature gates? Did you think about that a little bit?
I think it would be a separate feature gate with the technology that we have today. Actually, I think Patrick had a comment in here talking about how they actually did this for DRA. DRA has several different gates that are all getting promoted whenever they're ready. I guess presumably they got the load balance or load bearing order correct. But that seems like a good existence proof to me for how to do it.
Right.
So, Dims, I raised my hand after you started talking, so no problem. But I haven't had a chance to read your doc yet, but I think it's safe to assume that I'm supportive of the general idea, considering my historical position. And I will also point out that features like in-place pod updates are going through the same bump right now, where they'd like to move forward to beta, but they're making some changes which can't be done in beta in the same release. So they're going to add new gates that are like, we don't have a way of formalizing child gates, but they are effectively child gates. And so I think this pattern is real. I don't know who's got a ding, but something is dinging. Is it my phone?
Sorry, no, that was mine. I'll mute myself.
Sorry. So I agree with it just based on what you've described. I will try to read the doc very soon. I wanted to add one thing that I was actually just talking to Joe about this morning, which was the sort of everything must start in alpha. And that's primarily to prevent rollback problems, right? And we've got this compatibility versions KEP, and it's, inching along forward. It seems to me like these things put together make a better story, where if you have compatibility versions, you can ensure that there's not going to be a binary rollback before you enable the API. So, a trivial change, like in the in-place pod updates, they want to rename a const, one of the enums for a field. They can't do that without a new alpha gate, because they want to move forward the rest of the feature forward to beta, which means this change has to go backwards. So the complexity, the review overhead, just the maintenance overhead, I feel like a lot of that goes away. And it plays nicely with what you're saying here, in that they could have a derivative gate that started directly in beta if we thought that the risk was small enough. So +1.
Okay. I appreciate the +1, and I will try not to argue my way out of that +1. I see another benefit to alpha, and it is a benefit because you can merge partially complete code, right? So if you can stitch your feature all together in a single PR, you might be able to have like one giant mega PR that comes in. I've also seen many features that come in and have different pieces that merge at different times. And having the alpha gate ensures that we don't have that on until we see the entire story working end to end and have, for instance, the option on E2E test completing that, right? And so I see that benefit to an alpha gate as well. That doesn't mean you have to ship with it on, I guess, if we wanted to distinguish between must you ship an alpha first. But for that purpose, I see
To be clear, I didn't mean to say alpha gates are gone and they have no purpose anymore, but there is a class of trivial changes that we force through alpha that really shouldn't need to be.
Okay, that I definitely agree with. In fact, API Machinery has a couple in that are going to start in beta. Actually, you are a helper on one of those.
Starting in beta is okay. Like the PR that I was looking at this morning adds a const.
Yeah.
And like the risk of adding that const is pretty much zero, except for rollback.
Yeah. Jordan, looks like you're next.
Yeah, I'm +1 on the direction. It's also worth, as we're describing this for people who are following this guide, worth making it clear, like, people have more freedom while their thing is in alpha. It's kind of overhead and a pain to fragment your feature into like, and this gate controls this little addition, and this gate controls this little addition. And so it's certainly easier to just develop your thing in alpha and get it in shape, and then promote your one gate to beta and on by default. And so making it clear the benefit to people of you can iterate fast with lower overhead with a sort of homogeneous single alpha gate I also wanted to distinguish between secondary gates for sort of independent additive changes. Like we have a lot of, DRA is a good example of, we have the core thing, and then there's a long pipeline of like additive things we expect to happen. I'm a big fan of very targeted KEPs, where it's a coherent piece of functionality that we can complete and make production quality and deliver, and then do a follow-up to do an additive sort of orthogonal piece. And I think that's a good approach. But planning to have follow-ups where we're like, oh, it wasn't really production ready. We knew there were these aspects that needed to be in place before we would really consider this production ready. We'll promote the first thing to beta and on by default, and then follow up with these other things. That's what we're saying we shouldn't be doing. Like, if it's on by default, it should be production quality. So I'm +1 on that stance.
So that makes sense to me as well. Like with DRA, we had a minimum viable product. It was useful. It can be useful, and we want it to be production ready, but it's not. Yeah, thank you, Tim. Not the same as full featured. But there is one thing I wanted to raise, and I just commented in the doc. So one of this idea of additive, and so additive can mean, at least in the DRA case, additive of controls, where the initial base lacked certain controls. We add a new field that it provides additional controls. So from a backwards compatibility standpoint, we run into this API evolution issue that we talked about in that document that I referenced about composability of the API, right? We were going to end up in a place where we had a big one of, and each struct in the one of, each instance of type in the one of was a superset of the previous one. And you end up with this horrific API, right? So the proposal was to find a way to not build the API so that we end up with this terrible thing in the end. And we came to some conclusions, but I just want to make sure that I'm worried that we're not providing sufficiently granular versioning semantics in the API. We're able to do it in this case with a bunch of careful considerations, but it feels like there's a missing expressibility in that versioning and backwards compatibility functionality. So I see Tim has probably a lot to say on this because we've talked about it a lot.
Jordan was before me.
I think
That
he's
was
staying. Yeah.
Oh, well, okay. Yeah, I was actually surprised not to see that doc on the agenda. It's a well-framed doc, I think. It lays out the problem pretty clearly. We all know we have this problem. Like, it's not news, it shouldn't be news to any of us. But just to recap, I think the simplest expression here is go back and look at sidecar containers, right? We took a field that was effectively net new because you couldn't set it before, but we allowed you to set this field, and it changed the meaning of the sidecar of the init container struct. And if you had a back rev kubelet which didn't know about this new field, it would just do the wrong thing. And it probably wasn't egregious, but it didn't do what people expected to do, and it caused a bunch of confusion and chaos. And as a representative case of any back rev component that doesn't know about a new API feature, we don't have a clear solution or plan for this, right? Every time we add a new field that changes the meaning of existing of new objects which use this field. It won't change old objects, but it changes new ones which use it. We don't have a way for clients to know that they don't know. And there isn't a good answer. It's not like, oh, clearly we should just X. Like, none of us have been able to come up with a really good X yet.
Well, probably then we should. a lot of the same folks who come to this meeting had already reviewed the doc, but you're right, we should probably talk about it here as well. So I'll add it to the agenda for next time. I think in the immediate case, we have a few solutions and mitigations that can make it work. And, you know, feature gating is the biggest one, right? For the in-tree components, right? You control it with feature gating. We have out-of-tree components of drivers, DRA drivers, but we're going to recommend that they consume those feature gates as well. And that would be the safest thing to do. But you're right, there are issues with, I mean, that's not so much back rev, but that's like rollout of a feature gate enablement, right?
I mean, but even with feature gates, like I can turn the feature gate on, but if a component doesn't know about the feature gate because it didn't exist at the time the component was built, like that you can't know what you don't know unless we want to go and plumb, you know, strict unknown field checking all the way through clients.
There's a long discussion about it. I'll put the doc in the agenda for next time, and we can talk about it more. We do have a plan for DRA in 133. So I'm hoping we can still proceed with that plan, but we can talk about it in that meeting in 2 weeks. Anything else on this topic? So we have time to get to Justin's topic.
So the only thing that I wanted to ask was like, so the guidance from this doc when we update our documentation in K community or whatever is that we are okay with the new dependent additive stuff being either alpha or beta. If it is beta, then it better be really good quality. Otherwise, something of that sort, right? So we'll allow either. It doesn't have to be beta. It can be. People can do an alpha dependent on an existing beta.
Yes, they can.
Yeah, if the change that is determined to be necessary is considered risky enough or needs proving out, sure, yeah, whoever's driving the feature can always go real slow.
Right. So it's up to the SIGs and the approvers, existing approvers. It doesn't have to like come to us or anything of that sort.
I think there are cases where it would be required to be alpha. So what Tim mentioned, like some of the rollout mechanisms, like if you're adding a new field, if you realize you need a new field, right now, you have to make the previous version of the API server aware of it before you can let data be persisted in it. So for now, things like that would require going through an alpha stage first. It's possible that some of the compatibility stuff would let us get to the point where you could do it in a single release, but we're not there yet.
Okay. So between the KEP approvers, the API reviews, and PRR review, we are covered. Basically, is basically what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, the normal mechanisms should cover catching cases where, like, oh, you added a thing that's going to persist data. That means you needed to release rollout currently.
Right. And our documentation, we have to mention the dependencies between these, and that if they switched on a dependent gate, we don't automatically switch on the gate it depends on. So it needs to be clearly spelled out in our documentation and such.
Yeah, that's not automated now. We have that all over the place in DRA. We have like 6 feature gates or more probably, and if the first one's not enabled, none of them mean anything.
Okay.
The biggest
leave it at that way.
The biggest practical impact of this would probably be all the KEPs that have one set of beta graduation requirements and then a different set of stuff for GA graduation requirements. Pretty much all the things you're anticipating needing to do and complete, except maybe promote a test to conformance and like get feedback. Anything you're planning to do to make it production ready should be in the beta graduation requirements.
Yeah,
section.
There are things that are like, sorry, Tim, just to quickly respond to what Jordan said. Like in the DRA one, we have GA graduation criteria, like we have other people, other vendors that have created drivers, right?
Yeah.
And those are sort of external to the project, but like if nobody's using this thing,
feedback thresholds,
Yeah.
external evidence, all of
Yeah.
those are things that are sort of chicken and egg problems, sure. But like, we plan to finish test coverage. It's like, no. Go ahead, Tim. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna say the same thing more or less. The most salient point is about 2/3 down the screen right now, right? Promotion from beta to GA must be 0 diff for the release. I think we will need to clarify. Again, I haven't read the doc yet, so we'll need to clarify. Like, if I found a small bug in beta, does that mean I have to run one more release in beta, or am I allowed to fix a bug on the way up to GA? Clearly, I'm not allowed to change the API or majorly change the semantics. Am I allowed to fix a bug? Seems fair game, right? So we'll need to, I think, come up with some tighter principle for that.
Okay, so one last thing there is, so default to true, is there any change in when we could do that? For example, the DRA one, it's not yet default to true, it's waiting on something from
I think that maybe this would help describe that. It says the beta criteria needs to have all the functionality, security, and testing requirements, along with resolving known issues and gaps identified prior to beta. That's the threshold for going on in production in all Kubernetes clusters by default. And I think that's where you end up with what Jordan said about, hey, like those things other than gaining experience with it and correcting bugs found in the field for your GA criteria, those really need to be beta criteria.
Yeah, this definitely seems like we are raising the bar here on, so which is good.
Tim, your hand is up.
All right, so I think what I plan to do is leave this open for about another week. Be sure that I can address as much as I can in the doc, bring it forward into a PR and drop existing comments, tag people who had questions on a particular line to bring those up again, and refine from there. Unless this group thinks otherwise, I don't plan to go back in time and try to look at existing KEPs and say, do they meet this threshold? And we'll just sort of carry on for future ones.
Yeah, things that are going to beta in 134 are going to need, assuming this all gets merged, are going to need to follow this plan.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Okay. Justin SB.
Hello. Yes, I will try to keep this brief because I actually see Tim has 2 items actually after this on the agenda. 2 small items, I think he's saying. But essentially, we've been ping-ponged around through various SIGs. Arno and I are trying to tackle the problem of effectively the maintainer experience. Since 1.0, we have been saying how bad it is to be a maintainer, how maintainers are overworked, how maintainer attrition is a huge problem. But we've sort of treated it as if there were a deprecation guarantee. And I think we should stop doing that. And I think we should try to fix it. And I think we all have, we're all engineers. We all have some tools that we probably have written and some scripts that we've all written. And we should gather those up and see if we can actually together make our lives better. And so the concrete ask is just that we have a repo where we can all experiment and make progress together. We think that this is, I am optimistic because of the rise of AI for 2 reasons. One of which is, if you wanted to go through the old KEPs and move like beta requirements or GA requirements to beta, AI is good at that sort of thing. So there is the opportunity to leverage tools where previously it would have been an almost impossible problem. And secondarily, that AI sort of makes what is otherwise a relatively boring problem of writing maintainer tools into potentially a slightly more exciting problem that can get, some more contributors helping us all work together. So essentially, the ask is for an experimental repo where we can together write code that will never ship in Kubernetes, but will instead help us ship Kubernetes better. And that the eventual criteria or the eventual outcome of this would be, in a couple of months, we take a look at that repo and we say, yeah, this didn't really work. Like, let's just archive it. Or, yeah, this did work and it needs to be a working group, or it works great and we'll spin off, this bit works great and we'll spin it off into a project and do that sort of thing. But essentially, we gather tools, see if it actually helps us, and work together.
Justin, like, thank you for doing this. This is very important. We need to do this. We haven't invested time and effort. So please, I'm glad that you are bringing this up. Like, question is, what are like top 3 to your mind? 3 things that you want to tackle, in which order, right? Like, what do you want to do? That is the question that.
Hold on. Before you answer that, I would like to pose a thought question. So, some of our internal folks like Fede and team came to me and asked me this question: what are the things that you spend time on that aren't super interesting or super valuable, but are gated on a small number of people, or approver levels and those sorts of things, that you waste time on, right? And I gave them my list, and some of the things that I know Justin is looking at are coming in part from my list. I would actually be really curious if all the people on this call answered that same question. If you give me a list of 3 things that you do every release cycle or constantly that need you because of reasons, but aren't particularly valuable for you personally to be doing them. And I'm thinking of things like DEP approvals, right? I'll seed the conversation with one.
Absolutely. Like, I have a set of scripts that I use. Yes, absolutely.
I'm sure you do. So, like, before Justin goes and answers the things he's specifically targeting, I would love if people here just thought about that question. Give me 3 or 4 things that you spend time on that are sort of a boring waste of time and you wish you could have a robot do instead, if you trusted the robot.
Absolutely. If you want to crowdsource that, let's open up a doc and gather the things, right? And then, like, we have to prioritize the work too, right? Like, we can't go fix everything. So obviously, some of the things that have been hurting us is around the API reviews and, like, the crush of when we come nearer to a deadline, then there's a whole bunch of things to do, and then you don't even know if everybody has responded to all the things that you asked them to do, the sort of thing. So we like creating a repo. Yes, sure, let's do a repo. It's just the question of, like, who do you want to take along the journey with is the question, Justin. If it's just you, it's like, okay, fine, just go knock yourself out, right? But if you want to take some of these people who have been trying to spend time but haven't been able to, like, spend time more than what their employer allows, then that's the issue, right? Like, take more people along the journey, and to do that, let's either you can post, here is the set of things that I want to do, and then go on, or like collect more information and say, here is what more number of people have marked, like maybe rank them and like put them to vote, or whatever you want to do is fine. Like, so give some sort of like a kickoff for this repository to say, hey, this is what we're going to focus on first, so to say. And then, like you said, after 3 months, maybe it materializes, maybe it doesn't, right? So we'll know better at that time. It can be a throwaway repository for sure, and like you said, there's nothing to ship with Kubernetes itself. It's just that, see who you can bring along for the journey, because there is a lot more people out there who are interested in some bits and pieces. And especially if you say AI, there'll be even more people who will show up. So that's basically what I'm saying. And like, we do have resources across the hyperscalers to, like, through the accounts that we already have in K8s Infra. If we have to enable some of the AI features and allow access to these tools, then we can do that too. So that shouldn't be a problem. It's just that, where do you want to start, and like, how do you want to proceed?
Yeah, well, I mean, the good news is you can spell maintainers without AI twice. Right. And or I do want to actually create basically the framework to pull everyone in, right?
Yeah.
So where am I starting is like, there's a website. It looks a bit like the KEP Explorer website right now. And so people got a little confused, but it's dynamic. So if you want to put, it's a Go program. So if you want to start putting functionality in there, like, hey, I want to see related KEPs, then you can do it. Hey, I want to like flag all the KEPs which like look like beta, need the GA to beta move. You can do that. We can start to draft. And one of the things is starting to be able to draft PRs, right? Or PR reviews. So that PRs or PR reviews, both two things, right? So can we do the depth things, depth bumps in a way that is compliant with security, right? Because we're having some issues with that right now. Can we draft a PR review for you based on AI? And can we basically, I want to get it where like, I know you have scripts, right? Everyone has scripts. Everyone has a wish list. And today the problem is you have to like, if you wanted to improve the KEP Explorer or wanted to do something related to KEP, you have to go build all this website and all this stuff to get going, right? I want to create the place where you can be like, oh, I just want to add this little feature. So I will fork this repo, add it there. Maybe I'll send it upstream. Maybe I won't. But we want to make your life better and we want to encourage you to send it upstream, right? So one of the things that you can't automate today because you have to first like crawl GitHub PRs or crawl GitHub, like all of those things are the things where we have to start.
Right. We also have throwaway GitHub organizations too. So we are not limited to just repositories. So something to.
So I think, Justin, maybe if you just write a one pager that says, hey, here's the goal. And then at the second page is this crowdsourced list of things that Tim called out for. Like that will help people understand you're not just like, oh, here's an alternate version of something we already have. It's like, no, this is the basis for something different.
Yeah, right. I'm happy to do that. That'd be awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Justin.
Okay, Tim, it's you.
I'm next. I opened a PR last week on an idea, and I just wanted to throw it out here to see if there was anybody who had an obvious reason why it was stupid. And since API and validation falls under this group, here we are. So for anybody who doesn't know, I've been paying a lot of attention to validation stuff basically forever, but more recently trying to push this idea of declarative validation, scratching my own itch for getting rid of boring PRs. Validation code is the most boring code in the world to read, and also super delicate. So we've got a small group that has been pushing on this. We have a KEP. The KEP is hopefully moving forward in 33. One of the questions we have here came down to how can we, in a test, ensure that the validation that we run through the new mechanism is a subset of the validation that runs from the old mechanism? And I think it was a very interesting question. And I started digging through validation tests, and I was not shocked, but dismayed at how many tests are either completely incoherent and don't actually test the thing they think they're testing, or are matching validation errors on the exact validation string, to the extent that if you fix a typo in the string, you have to go update hundreds of test cases. And in fact, I have a change that would make the validation errors better for a particular class of errors, except it would change it from one error to potentially two errors, different errors, like the first and last letter must blah, 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 and the middle letters must blah, blah, blah. And going through and updating all those hundreds of test cases was enormously just like, I'm not going to do it, because the test cases are all coded to have one error string, right? So I got to go turn everything into lists and then write matchers, and it was egregious. And so we had this idea of, do you really need the error string? How specific do you need it to be? Well, if you know the validation errors, you know that we have a type field, and the type field is pretty coarse. It's like required, invalid, not supported. And we can match on that, but invalid is too broad. You can have invalid for many reasons, and it's not a sufficient test. So the idea was we could go and add a field to the error struct that was mostly for internal tracking. And I called it origin in my PR, but I don't love the name, and we'll go with the name somewhere else. But the idea was this field tracks the why did this validation error happen? Like, what was the source of it? And it was a little bit more semantic than a regex, it was like, this is supposed to be a DNS label. And DNS label has n errors that it could return, but they're all going to identify themselves as origin DNS label. And then the test could be written in terms of that. And hopefully that would make for far less brittle tests, easier to match tests, would still give us the confidence that we know what we're talking about, and would give us the ability to say, here's the set of errors that you got from the handwritten validation, and here's the set of errors you got from the declarative validation, and they match because the origins are a subset. I'll stop talking there and just see, anybody have strong objections to this? Because we've got people online ready to run with it.
What ultimately stops, like, I guess I can see how it's slightly different and better, slightly better than a string, but what ultimately stops us from like later deciding that there's another refactor that wants to change this intent string?
I mean, it's a fair question. In the declarative model, the intent string would basically come down to which declarative tag did you use, right? Did I say is a DNS label, or did I say is a DNS subdomain? Because actually the DNS subdomain code calls the DNS label code. So in this case, I think the intention is subdomain, not label. And so, you know, what would stop us from adding arbitrary strings there? We would stop ourselves. Like, we need to, you know, be vigilant about how brittle our tests are. The validation has become such a crap hole that I think we've stopped trying to keep it clean, and we just put sort of all of our dirty crap over there. And it's really bad. Like, some of these tests are really like horrifically bad, and I'm guilty of having written some of them, so blame me. We can do better than that.
That composition, I'm maybe it would help if you had an example to point at just to visualize it. I'm trying to understand like the composition. It reminds me of like Go error wrapping, where people used to like compare to exact error instances or type check a particular error against a particular class or a particular type, or they would substring check it, and all of those were terrible.
They're all terrible.
Error wrapping.
I don't think error wrapping actually makes that problem better. I think the Go pattern that works best here was asserting that the error has an interface, like is timeout, right? And like, I don't know why people moved away from that pattern, but it seemed to me like the most consistent pattern. But I can give you a very specific case. Like,
well, yeah, so like the where you were talking about, you know, domain validation delegates to label validation, unless you're doing wrapping. Like today, we just sort of accumulate a bunch of errors all the way down the stack. If you have a parent thing that calls down into a sub thing, which calls into a sub thing, they all bubble up errors and they all get included, and you end up with maybe a long list of field errors. And
right. So
we're expecting decoration so that the top level thing can say like, oh, this was a subdomain error.
So the way that it would work in the code is like, there's a function validate DNS subdomain, and validate DNS subdomain breaks the string up into pieces and calls validate label on each piece. So for those errors that it gets back from label, they would be decorated as origin DNS label. The DNS subdomain would say, yeah, actually your origin is subdomain because that was the intent that the user called. So like, there's this entry point into the validation logic that is what the user intended. So if I was writing a test, I would say, you know, I'm fuzzing field, not fuzzing, but I'm giving bad value for field foobar, and foobar is supposed to be a DNS subdomain. So I'm going to assert that I got an error back that says DNS subdomain. And if I got back an error that says DNS label, my test is going to fail, right? But if I got it back saying,
like at the limit, like we call validate pod, which calls validate containers, which calls validate DNS name, which calls validate DNS label. Like,
so you apply the decoration
which levels. Which levels say I am the authoritative intent, or do they just wrap all the way up? I don't know. I'm having a hard time picturing it.
I mean, yes, there's a little bit of judgment involved there. Like, I think it's at the field level. Like, if you were like at the scalar field level, more or less, the place where you would put a validation tag in declarative model is where you want your intent to be, I think. But the PR that I offered was pretty trivial, and it just showed that it was possible without breaking all of CI. And I want to take the leash off and let Yongri or Aaron run with it and see what other problems they can find. But I wanted to sort of pre-flight it here. I see a couple of hands. I think Dan was first.
So how does the intention, origin, whatever, end up being more interesting or different than just the field name?
Because I can validate a field against multiple validations. I can have a field that says its string length must be less than 100 characters, and it must meet some format, right? And so if I get back an error that says field name value type invalid, that is insufficient to prove that in fact the right validation was called.
Yeah, so the test would be asserting all three things.
Yes, the test would say
I made invalid objects in this field. I'm expecting a particular type of invalid validation error for
That's
this.
right. Which it does today by just matching the exact string. Sometimes those strings are hundreds of characters long. Sometimes those tests do regex matching. Sometimes they do substring matching. Sometimes they do prefix matching. Sometimes they just don't even look at the string, even though they should. Like it's all over the map. If we had an origin, then we could have a simple matcher library that says, I'm expecting errors of these origins. Go look at the input errors and make sure that I got all the ones I expected and didn't get any I didn't expect.
Okay, we're just about out of time. Justin?
I just want to quickly ask, is this an internal testing thing, or is this going to be in any way exposed in the API, right? Because if it's internal testing, who cares,
it's
right?
It's entirely on internal for us, the project. I mean, for now, I mean, maybe it's useful for end users, I don't know, but for now it's entirely internal. It has to be a public field on the error struct because that's the way our errors library is defined, but I think it's entirely for us to use internally for testing.
So we'd have to document that there's no backward compatibility guarantees on this field.
Yeah, I mean, it's not serialized. It's not part of the string method of that type, right? It's there so you can poke at it in a test. And the reason I'm bringing it to this group is because obviously validation is tens of thousands of lines of code in our code base, and there are lots and lots and lots of validation tests, and every KEP cycle we have dozens of PRs that add new APIs that have validation in it. So if we can show that this works and we can start the process of converting, and actually this is an advantage because you can convert sort of one test at a time, then I would ask that people here, as you review PRs, would say, hey, actually, you should do your validation test this way.
I guess as a counter, I agree that our validation tests are terrible and we should have like better recommended approaches. I'm curious how much mileage we could get out of like a prefix on the error message string.
So like
returned.
I'll give you the concrete answer that drove me down this path. I wanted to fix an error to give better, or fix a validation to give better error messages by breaking it up into two separate error messages instead of returning 280 characters of error string. And I didn't want to turn it into a regex because that's a useless error message also. And so I said, look, I'm going to change the logic so that it gives you one error or the other, or both if you tripped on both. And then I found, again, hundreds of test cases that just say like the name can't be garbage, and it throws garbage in it and it trips up both of those errors. So now I get back two error messages when I was expecting one. And the test itself now needs to change to have all the test cases have a slice of strings instead of a string.
Your origin would be for the list or for each entry in the list?
The origin would be for each entry in the list, but I can say, I don't care if you got 1 or 10 errors from the same origin. I was expecting an error for this origin.
But that, I mean, those are bad tests and we have to change them anyway. As we're changing bad tests, could we change them to look for an error I recognize from the list and tolerate additional ones? Probably.
We can. I started doing that, and then I
Yeah.
went, oh my God, there are so many of these. If I'm going to change them, I would like to change them once to one function that says, I'm going to do a match and then an exclusion and see which fell outside of the center part of the Venn diagram, and then throw t.errors on all of those.
Okay, well, we're past time, so folks. So thank you. I guess Tim, your next phone home thing will go to the next call.
Yeah, there's a policy, so let's make sure we read the policy before we talk about it.
Is there policy even about discussing it?
No, about what we can gather or what stuff like that.
Sure. It was just something that was bothering me a lot lately, and I thought I would bring it up again. I like getting yelled at.
One last thing for this group is Tim was proposing a was it Randfill, sorry. GoFuzz, taking over GoFuzz.
Yeah. Does anybody care? Like, we use the Google GoFuzz library in a bunch of places. It's a nice little library, largely written by Lavalamp. And it's about 700 lines of code in total. It's actually super easy to follow. Nobody at Google was officially maintaining it, so it was archived. I propose that we bring it into Kubernetes SIGs, give it a better name because it's not really fuzzing, and use it from there. And I'll sign myself up for maintaining it because it's really not that hard.
Works for me.
And it would be under the auspices of SIG testing, just because it's used in tests.
Okay.
Thank
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks all. Nice to see you.